You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 370 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Happy Halloween. In honor of the 31st of October and All Hallows Eve, we're going to investigate a historical incident of witches and witchcraft. Malcolm Gaskill is an emeritus professor of early modern history at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. He's also among the foremost experts on witches and witchcraft in the early modern world. Now, although Malcolm's study of witches and witchcraft is mainly focused on England, his newest book, The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World, focuses on a witchcraft trial that took place in colonial Massachusetts in 1651, 41 years before the infamous Salem witchcraft trials in 1692. During our investigation of witches and witchcraft, Malcolm reveals how people understood witches and witchcraft in early modern England and how those ideas translated to 17th century Massachusetts. Details about the colonial settlement at Springfield, Massachusetts, which is located in the Connecticut River Valley, and how a married couple in Springfield, Hugh and Mary Parsons, came to be accused and tried for witchcraft in 1651. But first, did you know that the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation runs the world's largest museum dedicated to helping you investigate and explore the history and origins of the United States? As the world's largest United States history museum, Colonial Williamsburg always has a lot of research, activities, and programming taking place all year round. To stay up to date with what Colonial Williamsburg and its scholars are discovering about the past, and to explore its wide range of activities and programming, sign up for one of its email lists at benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. Again, to sign up for one of Colonial Williamsburg's email lists, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. Okay, are you ready for some serious history about witches and witchcraft? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an emeritus professor of early modern history at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. He's one of the leading experts in the history of witchcraft, with 4 of his 7 books dedicated to this topic, including Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and Witchcraft, a very short introduction. His most recent book is also about witches and witchcraft. It's called The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Malcolm Gaskill.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
And it's been a while too, Malcolm. I think the last time we spoke was in episode 49, when we talked about your then new book, Between Two Worlds, How the English Became Americans. And I have to say, as we researched your biography for this episode, it seems like Between Two Worlds may have been an outlier in your publication history in that all of your other books really do focus on witches and witchcraft. So I wonder if we could begin our conversation with having you tell us what fascinates you about witches and witchcraft.
For a historian like me, they're just a very good way into understanding past mentalities and social relations. You can see all sorts of things in there, like the development of law and of literacy and of popular culture. All early modern life is there in a witchcraft trial, and you can really see how those things fit together. I think the other thing for an early modern historian like me is that witchcraft cases are a very good way of understanding not just, an alien lost world, but understanding change. Because witchcraft accusations are always rather awkward, difficult, frustrating things for the people who are involved, and they're never straightforward. And in some of that kind of indecision, we can really see a transition between some older ways of thinking and something which we would think of as modernity.
Speaking of those older ways of thinking, most of your books concern the history of witches and witchcraft in early modern England. Would you provide us with a very short introduction to witches and witchcraft in early modern England and tell us how the people in England understood witchcraft during the early modern period, which is the period that took place roughly between 1400 and 1800?
Witchcraft really is the idea that somebody would form a pact with the devil and would use the devil's power for illegal ends. So that could be bewitching your neighbor's chickens, or it could be forming a pact with the devil, which was an act of apostasy, really, or of heresy even. But really, when we talk about witchcraft in early modern England, we're really talking about the crime of maleficium. That's the crime of ordinary people in ordinary neighborhoods accused by their neighbors of causing harm. So it could be threatening their families and their children, or it could be threatening their livestock or their crops and so on. So all the things in these very precarious lives that were extremely precious to people could theoretically be threatened by witches. That really was the kind of dark fantasy of what witches were supposed to do. So in the early modern period, the belief in witches is absolutely endemic, widespread. Suspicions are a little less common. It's not that everyone is obsessed with witches all the time. But when we actually get to public accusations, and particularly trials and executions, they're much less frequent. They're a much rarer occurrence than I think that people sometimes think. So we're really talking about the period roughly between 1560 and 1680, something like that, with a kind of spike in the reign of Elizabeth I in the 1580s and 1590s, and then another spike in the 1640s and 50s around the time of the English Civil War and the Revolution. So witchcraft accusations, trials always kind of feed on social disquiet, social anxiety, economic problems and political uncertainty as well.
So it sounds like witchcraft may have been used to explain what seemed unexplainable during times of great social change.
Well, that's a very common way of thinking about witchcraft. We look backwards from our vantage point. It's very difficult to understand what witchcraft meant as an idea at the time. So we tend to think we have all sorts of ways of explaining things, scientific ways, mechanistic understandings of the universe. And we think they didn't. Therefore, they had to try and explain things in another way. But if we go backwards in time and think about it from them, our ancestors looking forward, in their world, they weren't trying to explain things. It was just the explanation, although it wasn't consensual. And the idea that, if livestock died or a child was sick, there was very rarely consensus about the fact that that had been caused by witchcraft. It's just that some people believed it. Other people thought that there wasn't really the evidence that you could rely on to actually prove that that was the cause.
What would have counted as witchcraft or be seen and understood as witchcraft by people living in England during this 1560 to 1680 period?
The evidence for it was often very scant. It could really just be hearsay that, say, a neighbour had a bit of a reputation for using magic, maybe for good ends, maybe for healing and so on. But that if somebody fell out with a neighbour and that some words were exchanged, some kind of threat that we might think was actually really rather innocent, but in this rather fraught environment could be interpreted as much more sinister than maybe it looks on the page. So that really witchcraft is about bad relations between neighbours. It's a hostile atmosphere that exists between people who should really be living in loving charity and relying on each other. That was the ideal of the time. So that really what counts for witchcraft is whatever somebody claims and is prepared to go to law to sue for. It's the idea that somebody has malevolent intent towards you and that they are using this illicit magic, the devil's power, in order to further their interests, particularly to get revenge.
In his latest book, The Ruin of All Witches, Malcolm turns his study from witchcraft in early modern England to witchcraft in colonial North America. Specifically, he turns his attention to witchcraft in 17th century Massachusetts. Malcolm, did the colonists who settled in 17th century Massachusetts understand witches and witchcraft in the same ways that we've been talking about in early modern England?
The concept is pretty much identical. Let's not forget that the people who lived in Massachusetts in the 1640s and 1650s, many of them had been born in England. They called themselves the English, or actually in Springfield, quite a lot of them are Welsh. But they consider themselves to be English. They consider New England not to be something different from England, but kind of an outlier. It's quite hard for us to think about this now, in the same way it's difficult for us to conceptualize witchcraft. But their identity was very much still rooted in the old world and connected to it. So it wasn't just that they had ancestors and relatives there, they considered themselves still to be part of that world. And of course, many settlers travelled back to England temporarily or went back permanently. So they're still very kind of culturally and emotionally connected to where they'd come from. So that their mentalities and their ideals and their beliefs are actually really very similar to those that one would find in the British Isles at that time. The difference, I suppose, is that they were facing particular kinds of challenges to make a world for themselves out of as they saw it, the wilderness.
I was actually going to ask about this idea of the wilderness and environment and how they impacted the colonists' understandings of witches and witchcraft. Because in our mind, and in the movies that we've all seen about witches and witchcraft, we picture England as a place with small towns and farm fields. We don't really picture England as having a lot of forests and trees, but in 17th century Massachusetts, there were a lot of forests and trees because they hadn't been fully cleared to support farming or the construction of small little New England towns. So Malcolm, what does having these forests filled with indigenous peoples and animals surrounding the colonists' new settlements mean for these early Bay colonists' understandings of witches and witchcraft?
Yeah, I think the wilderness is a physical thing and it's also a state of mind. And that really those two things get fused together in the colonial imagination. So that having said that these people are essentially culturally English, inevitably they feel that they're a long way from home. Homesickness is very common in the colonial experience of that time, and that's sometimes why people really do decide to throw in the towel and go home again. But there is something about being there out on the frontier, and the Connecticut River Valley really is the furthest western extent of New England at that time. And there's a lot that they are afraid of and a lot they don't know about. There's this kind of slightly fairy tale-ish, nightmarish world about being, at the edge of this great river, lost on the edge of a forest with all these kind of unseen dangers, Native Americans, wolves, so that there is this existential threat that they face, which is just not really present in the same way in England. And they do, of course, feel, and this is, I think, a feeling which becomes even more acute as we go forward into the 1660s, 1670s, where tensions with Native Americans increase dramatically, leading to a devastating war in the 1670s. There is this fear that New England might actually cease to exist. For all the political turbulence that England faces in the middle of the 17th century, nobody in England actually really fears that England will cease to exist. They don't quite know where it's going, but they don't think that England will be wiped off the map. But that it really is part of the mentality of the New England settler.
One of the most fascinating aspects of Malcolm's book, The Ruin of All Witches, is that most scholars who focus on witchcraft in 17th century Massachusetts investigate the Salem witch trials of 1692. But Malcolm's book focuses on another, much earlier incident of witchcraft accusations in Massachusetts that took place in Springfield in 1651. Malcolm, would you tell us how you learned about the Springfield witchcraft incident? Because I think many of us have heard of the Salem witch trials. We at least know that they took place, but I don't think many of us have ever heard about the Springfield witchcraft trials of 1651.
Without wishing to be too kind of spooky about it, I feel sort of as if the Springfield story was pestering me, trying to get my attention, had been for a number of years. I'd kind of heard about it many years ago just for being a historian of witchcraft. It was a story that had been known about, just not extensively studied. And then when I wrote Between Two Worlds, I wrote a little bit more about it. And at that point, I did actually read the original documentation a bit more thoroughly. And it just became struck what an amazing opportunity there was in the original court depositions that were used against Hugh and Mary Parsons, the two figures at the center of the story. What a great opportunity there was to write a microhistory. I think historians need big, broad overviews, and that's really what Between Two Worlds was. But sometimes you need to really close the focus in very tightly on an individual story, because it's only there that you can understand the close personal relationships, the difficult social relationships, the emotions, the dreams, the mentalities, which actually all come together to make a witchcraft accusation real. And I think that's one of the difficult things that we have from our vantage point in time, is actually understanding how something like witchcraft could seem very, very real indeed. So in the end, it's only by actually trying to understand these people as living, breathing, sentient individuals like ourselves, that we can actually understand how something like the belief in witchcraft and specifically accusing others could actually become concrete.
Well, we would love to investigate the Springfield incidents of witchcraft. So let's start with an overview of what Springfield, Massachusetts was like in terms of its environment and its inhabitants by 1651.
Springfield is a frontier town. It's not kind of a frontier town in the, like our image of the Wild West, but for them it really was on the edge. It's kind of a liminal space between the known and the unknown. Springfield is 100 miles west of Boston and the familiar satellite towns around Boston that were formed from the 1630s onwards with the Great Migration from that time. A lot of these eastern townships had been, in a sense, transplanted congregations, Puritan congregations, which had come out of England really kind of ready-made to spread the gospel and live according to their own conscience in this place. Springfield really isn't like that. It's a godly place, but it's set up specifically from the start as a company town. That's to say, a town which will make profit. And so, although it's godly, and that William Pynchon, who is everything really in Springfield, he's its founder, he's its chief magistrate, he's its landowner, he's chief employer, and so on and so on. But William Pynchon really wants it to be a godly, pious place, but that's not its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is for people to come and work hard and to make profits, above all, for William Pynchon, particularly out of the fur trade.
Was Springfield successful in terms of getting a good fur trade going and making a profit, or were those just unrealized goals?
Well, it's a town of winners and losers. Really, it's a kind of capitalist story. I suppose that it is successful in the sense that it isn't wiped off the map, and some places really are during those native wars of the 1670s. It's almost completely burnt to the ground, but it rises again, and of course it becomes a very important city by the middle of the 19th century. So it does thrive, but you know that some people profit and some people fail, and that William Pynchon, as the overlord, and his successor, his son John, they're actually pretty ruthless. And everybody owes their existence to the Pynchons because they offer everything on credit. They supply the land and everything that goes with it. But if you can't pay back that debt, the Pynchons will ruin you. And so it's a very kind of harsh environment. In the period that we're talking about, the middle of the 17th century, there are only about 40-odd households, about 100 people, something like that, from the start, because Springfield is founded in about 1635, 1636. Pynchon has restricted this because he doesn't want the number of people there to outstrip the resources. Boston, for example, has kind of grown apace. You know, people arriving in Boston by the later 1630s, there's nowhere for them to go. They have to go down the muddy river, which is as kind of unappealing as it sounds, because actually the resources get used up very, very quickly indeed. And these people have really only gone there for land. That's the most important thing. But they find that actually even this can be in short supply. So Pynchon's very careful to manage it. I think a lot of the early success or the opportunities that Springfield affords are due to his careful management of the balance of land and resources, and also the political relations with local Native Americans, which Pynchon is pretty careful about.
Given witchcraft's supposed connections with the devil and the fact that William Pynchon really wants Springfield to be a godly community, would you tell us a bit more about the role of the church in 17th century Springfield?
Unfortunately, we've got fantastic records for Springfield in all sorts of areas. We've got Pynchon's account books, and we have records of births, deaths, and marriages. But the church records don't really start until the early 18th century. So a lot of time we're not sure. So some of it is kind of supposition, or some of it's really extrapolation of the way things were in other Connecticut River Valley towns. What I think we can reasonably suppose about Springfield is that it is a place where godly ideals are important. So William Pynchon brings in all sorts of trades whenever he needs them. If suddenly they feel that they're short of barrels, they will bring in a cooper. If they need to repair a cart, he will bring in a wheelwright, and so on, because he wants Springfield to be as self-sufficient as possible. So that from the later 1630s, he brings in a minister, George Moxon. And Moxon, really like Pynchon, becomes not just a kind of spiritual guide to the town, but a political leader too. the importance of religion, the importance of having a meeting house where people attend church services regularly, this is all observed in Springfield. This is extremely important to its life. And I think actually the fact that it is still so important there is quite interesting because it means that the tension with some of these more worldly ideals, I think, is going to be greater than you would find in some of those settlements further to the east. Now, even there, Puritans don't eschew worldly things. They think that religion and profit jump together, and they believe that this is God's plan for them, that they should profit and they should multiply and so on. But that at Springfield, I just think it's a little bit that the tension between those kind of old and new ideals is more acute. And I think we find that actually later on at Salem as well.
The Ruin of All Witches, Malcolm's book, centers on the story of Hugh and Mary Parsons, a couple who lived in Springfield, Massachusetts, and who were accused and tried for witchcraft in 1651. Malcolm, who were Hugh and Mary Parsons? Would you tell us about their lives?
So Hugh Parsons, we don't know too much about his background. He was almost certainly English, and he comes to America in the 1630s. And the important thing about Hugh Parsons is not only that he's rather unpleasant, to say the least. Actually, he really can't control his anger at all. But he's a brickmaker. He's another one of those people that William Pynchon brings into Springfield to try to make it self-sufficient. Now, bricks, we would, of course, take bricks for granted because they're freely available. Our houses are made of them. It's not really a problem. But in 17th century Springfield, bricks are incredibly important because you make chimneys out of them. And there are two reasons why brick chimneys are important. One is that wooden chimneys catch fire, and that's obviously a problem. But in Springfield, brick chimneys are also a status symbol. And one of the problems a lot of colonial communities have, this is true in Virginia, it's true throughout 17th century colonial America, is about differentiating different levels of authority in the social order. So to have a brick chimney is a way of saying, I'm more important than you. It's a bit of conspicuous consumption. But again, it's not just economic or consumerist showing off. It is actually a way of politically differentiating yourself from your neighbor. So that's why Hugh Parsons is important. And that's why people are dependent on him. And that's difficult because he's very unpleasant. Mary Lewis is a very troubled woman who comes from Wales. She's been married in Wales. Her husband has deserted her and bullied her for not being a Catholic as he was. And she joins this rather charismatic Protestant sect, I suppose we'd call it. And then with other like-minded people, leaves Wales and comes to America. And she enters service with William Pynchon, or William Pynchon's daughter. And in 1645, the stars align, and that's how Hugh and Mary meet, and they are soon married.
So Hugh and Mary weren't on the top of the social scale in 17th century Springfield, but they're still important people to the community given the labor that they perform. So it sounds like they were probably in the middling to lower end of the town's social scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly right. So they live in the south end of the town, and it's very difficult to describe to listeners what a town looks like on a map, but we might think of it as a sort of ribbon development. It's a long, narrow place, really following the contours of the Connecticut River, and the main street runs right along that. And so the town grows along this. People have planting grounds to the west and their woodlots to the east. But of course, so the town tends to sort of grow vertically, and they're right down the south end, which by the 1640s, that's really where newcomers are being settled. So you're moving further and further away from the hub of power. So the further you move away from the center, the more kind of ambiguous I think your status can become. But with Hugh Parsons, the importance really is that he makes bricks. And that's what really, more than anything else, makes him valuable, but also brings him into conflict with his neighbors.
Malcolm, what do you think we need to know about Hugh and Mary and their family to best understand why they were accused of witchcraft in 1651?
Hugh and Mary and their marriage, their household, is a very good illustration of how witchcraft accusations start more generally in Europe and in Britain and so on. We tend to have this idea that witchcraft accusations start because people can't explain things and they're looking for scapegoats, or they want to get rid of people they don't like. I think that Hugh and Mary Parsons have a fair crack of the whip, really. I think that they would be included and they would be accepted, but they just don't kind of play by the rules. what we can understand from Hugh and Mary, what they illustrate so well, is that there are expectations, customary cultural expectations of the way that your neighbours are supposed to behave. So that a man needs to be a man and a woman needs to be a woman. And that's not some kind of crude reduction associated with sex or with gender, but to do with the social construction of a man and a woman within the community. Really, that they're supposed to be, first and foremost, good neighbours, and that the household is supposed to be harmonious, and they are supposed to be kind of in love with their neighbours. That sounds odd to us, but that's not a phrase that they would have felt was particularly strange. That was an ideal. And the Hugh and Mary are just awkward. They are just difficult, and they make people uncomfortable. And in a world which is already rather economically precarious, one of the things you're looking for in your neighbours is a sense of reassurance and of trust and of reputation and of honour and all those things which were ideals, and that Hugh and Mary just don't feel right in that world. So we could look at them as scapegoats, but actually I don't think that that's as kind of random or as crude as we might suppose. Really, they just feel wrong in a world where it's very important that your neighbours feel right.
So Hugh and Mary were insiders, but they were also outsiders within the Springfield community.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Really, witchcraft accusations is about ambiguity. They're not about being absolutely, utterly reviled. They're about, falling between two stools, really, being kind of there in the neighbourhood and not always being dreadful. And actually, as with Hugh, people do rely on him. People do look on him. They offer him their respect, but that he just doesn't kind of quite reciprocate. And that pushes them further outside the circle. It makes them kind of literally eccentric to the point where actually they're ostracized.
The community of Springfield's charges of witchcraft against Hugh and Mary Parsons came during the winter of 1650-1651. Malcolm, before we investigate what prompted the Parsons neighbors to accuse them of witchcraft, we should take a brief moment to thank our episode sponsor. The Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg invite you to join them for I Made This, a dynamic conference exploring the lives and work of Black artists and artisans from the 18th to the 21st centuries. This conference will feature keynote lectures by founding members of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archives, Dr. Tiffany Monman and Dr. Torrance Gatson. There will also be an opening dinner and presentation by the James Beard Award-winning author Michael Twitty, who is the expert behind the Afro Culinaria Food Blog, a blog dedicated to communicating information about African-American foodways. The I Made This Black Artists and Artisans Conference will take place at the Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg on November 10 and 11, 2023. For more information and to register, visit benfranklinsworld.com/IMadeThisConference. That's benfranklinsworld.com/IMadeThisConference. Malcolm, what happened during the winter of 1650-1651 that prompted the Parsons neighbors to accuse them of witchcraft? Just how awkwardly were they behaving during that winter?
There isn't a kind of sudden calamity. It's really a sort of slow burning resentment against them. It's their reputation. And of course, in this world, reputation is a matter of life and death, really. If you don't have a good reputation with the neighbours, you simply can't live in that community. And that reputation is sort of being eroded gradually, bit by bit, so that this kind of trust, which is so important, is really edging into suspicion and actually into naked hostility. The people in Springfield do feel the existential danger of the old world too. There's a civil war going on in England between 1642, and it's still not being resolved. In 1649, of course, Charles I is executed. Charles I is their king. Some of them perhaps didn't love him that much, but there is this feeling that the old world is being turned upside down and that they're actually part of that too. I think that does affect them. But much closer to home, you see from 1647 that there are witchcraft trials creeping up the Connecticut Valley. There are accusations at Windsor, there are accusations in Wethersfield, and there are trials and executions. And this crime of witchcraft, which seemed rather abstract, even kind of theoretical before, is suddenly feeling very, very real. So in order to have a proper witch trial, witchcraft needs to become plausible. There needs to be this tipping point where actually, rather than thinking, well, I believe in witches, but I don't know any, There are people in the Connecticut Valley at Hartford who see executions, and then it feels that witchcraft is coming very close to home. So that's something that happens by the middle of the 1650s. But for Hugh and Mary, it's really, I think, that people have had enough. They've so run down their store of good credit that they've kind of got nothing left.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how accusations of witchcraft can revolve around hard-to-explain events, and also around people, like the Parsons, who just can't conform in the ways that society wants them to conform. What we haven't really talked about yet are rumors and gossip, and how rumors and gossip can spread around town and lead to witchcraft accusations. So, Malcolm, would you tell us about the rumors and gossip that spread around Springfield about the Parsons, and when those rumors and gossip turned into something more serious?
It starts a little bit earlier. Actually, it's not the kind of stereotype way that we sometimes think about the way the witchcraft accusations start. Mary Parsons starts this herself. She actually starts spreading a rumor that a woman called Mercy Marshfield, who's arrived in Springfield from the town of Windsor, has, as she says, brought the devil with her because there have been witchcraft accusations there. And actually, the neighborhood is very skeptical, to the point that they actually think not only is this unfounded slur against Mercy Marshfield, but that really perhaps that Mary Parsons is a bit too obsessed about witches. Again, we look back and we think, oh, everyone was obsessed with witches. How could any early modern person be too obsessed with witches? But in their world, they don't blame everything on witchcraft. Largely, they do accept God's providence for misfortunes, and they start to think this is an unhealthy obsession. So that Mary kind of starts it, but that once she starts it herself, people start to think, well, actually, if she's so obsessed with getting rid of witches, maybe something not quite right about her. So it really starts to blow up in her face. In fact, Mercy Marshfield prosecutes her for slander in 64, and she loses. So this really brings her out. It's a kind of form of public exposure where it feels that she's the one that's talking about witches. But then subsequently, of course, some of the people involved in that slander trial, both Mercy Marshfield and her family, find themselves the subject of some rather unpleasant misfortunes. And that then makes them connect up the dots with some of the harsh things that Hugh Parsons has said, for example, to their husbands over these brick deals that nearly always go wrong. So that Springfield does suffer its own misfortunes, but they're not out of the ordinary. It's just that they take on particularly sinister significance because of these difficult people in their midst and these rather toxic relations which have developed. So that women have difficult births. Some children die. There are some other things like tools go missing and some meat goes missing from a pot. Some puddings fail. These things seem kind of trivial, but when you put them all together, set against a man who has a motive, Hugh Parsons, for disturbing his neighbours' lives, then suddenly it seems like maybe he is the cause of these things. They don't know, but a pattern forms in their minds that maybe there's some enemy within, and that he's no longer just an unpleasant presence in their midst. He's a downright malevolent one.
So Hugh and Mary were suspected of witchcraft for two different reasons. One reason being that Mary seems to be, according to her neighbors, obsessed with witches. And the other reason was that he was really just an unpleasant person, like you've told us, who was upset about brick deals. And coincidentally, their disgruntlement really goes along with the trouble that Springfield was experiencing. And neighbors drew a correlation.
Yeah. I think that with Hugh as a witch, his witchcraft in their minds, the main constituent is his anger. And that witchcraft is, we don't always think about witchcraft in these terms, but that witchcraft in the 17th century mind is associated with a whole string of negative emotions, anger and fear and melancholy and envy. And this is really what Hugh is. He's an envious, avaricious, very angry man who can't control himself. Mary is suffering from some kind of mental illness. We don't know, and I don't speculate really in the book, although it's certainly the case that her symptoms are consistent with postpartum psychosis, which is a more severe condition, a much rarer condition than postnatal depression, because it really can cause hallucinations and delusions and also murderous impulses towards children. The intrusive thought of postpartum psychosis is that people would be better off without you. And that can mean sometimes suicide, but it can also mean the killing of children who really shouldn't grow up with that mother. That's one of those intrusive thoughts, and we don't know. But I think that she is clearly not of sound mind. She's not stigmatized for mental illness, but her mental illness means that she is not in the swim of things, and she is not behaving in the eyes of her female neighbors, particularly in the way that they would want her to.
So Hugh and Mary's neighbors suspected them of witchcraft. What happened next? What was the process for residents of Springfield to make a formal accusation of witchcraft against the Parsons and to bring the Parsons to trial to answer their accusations?
In the same way that their reputation is being gradually eroded, the process by which they're accused is a sort of drip, drip until it becomes a flood. In Springfield, if you want anything, you go to William Pynchon. That's what you do. He is also the chief magistrate, as well as being everything else in the town, so that he will take your testimony if you have some complaint. And of course, he does this in all sorts of complaints. So in the slander case against Mary Parsons, he just sits as the judge in that case. This is a little bit more serious. He's not going to be able to make a summary judgment about witchcraft because this is a felony. And a felony under English law transported to America is something that can only be heard by a superior court because it is a capital crime. And it's a capital crime according to the Code of Massachusetts. If you're found guilty, the punishment is hanging. But people initially make complaint to William Pynchon that they suspect that there's something wrong about Hugh and Mary Parsons, particularly about Hugh Parsons, and that he starts to recall the testimony. But part of the gossip that gets back, of course, is you can imagine someone will say, "Oh, did you go to William Pynchon? Yeah, you should go too. Did he listen to you? Yeah, he wrote it all down." You know, it's not too much of a stretch of imagination to understand how the confidence to make an accusation could gather momentum.
If we had the ability to attend this trial, what kinds of evidence would we hear? What were people offering against Hugh and Mary Parsons? And what kind of evidence and defense did the Parsons offer to defend themselves and refute these accusations?
Mary, and actually, to be honest, she doesn't really defend herself very much. I think what she's insinuating is that she believes that she's a witch against her will, whereas Hugh feels like a witch who is doing it on purpose. Because there certainly is the idea that women just felt that they were so swamped by this sense of diabolic wretchedness that they just kind of confessed, and that's how she mostly conducts herself. Hugh is different. Hugh is a very silent, taciturn man who doesn't say very much when he's accused, but he just says, "I'm innocent and I didn't do it." And he denies that actually, he said the things that he did. But he does admit that he is often angry, and he does admit that he's been angry with his wife because, of course, their marriage is a disaster. And he is controlling and coercive and abusive towards his wife in a really dreadful way. And, of course, I think that does also, of course, impact upon her emotional state as well. One thing that's used against Hugh is that when their son, Samuel, dies, the suspicion is that Hugh has killed him with witchcraft. And the main evidence against Hugh is that he didn't show the right kind of emotion. He just seemed to brush it off, and he went to someone's house and he filled his pipe with tobacco and he had a smoke and didn't seem upset. And one of the interesting things, in fact, it's a pivotal moment, that in this pre-trial hearing, Hugh says he was upset. He was incredibly upset. He just didn't know how to show it. And he went off into the fields on his own. And I think that for this really rather unpleasant man, there's just this slight grain of sympathy for him, that he's a man trying to be sort of the social man in this rather fraught environment. And he feels that he gets it completely wrong. And that he says he shed tears, but he didn't want anybody to see. It becomes rather a kind of a sad story, I think. And from that point, we really start to feel that just everything has gone wrong in their marriage and their lives. And that there's this sense of doom that settles upon them from which they can't escape.
What kind of punishment were Hugh and Mary looking at if they were convicted of witchcraft?
Well, witchcraft is right at the top of the Massachusetts criminal code. The punishment is death. In Massachusetts, more so than in England, that the criminal code follows Mosaic law, and the Bible says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And that really means that if you are found guilty of witchcraft, there really is only one punishment, and that is to be hanged, as for other felonies. The punishment wasn't burning in America or in England. You do find that in Scotland, and it was standard form of execution in continental Europe. But for the Anglo-American felony, the standard punishment was hanging. But the problem is how one proves this. And this is actually why the executions for witchcraft in the Anglo-American world are much rarer than we sometimes think. So the potential punishment was extremely serious, but actually the means of proving this very difficult, dark, diabolical, rather murky crime was very, very difficult indeed to prove. And so that one finds that actually a lot of the time the courts are much more circumspect than we might think, because really, although they are rather kind of harsh people in all sorts of ways, one of the things they don't want to do is execute somebody that might actually turn out to be innocent.
I know you would like us to read The Ruin of All Witches to find out what happens to the Parsons. Still, I wonder if you would share, do we know if the Parsons witchcraft trials and what happened in Springfield and along the Connecticut Valley in 1651 impacted the later witch hunts like the one in Salem in 1692? Did these earlier witchcraft experiences inform later ones?
I think that what happens in Springfield, certainly, is that it doesn't really seem to make any difference at all. I think everybody's convinced themselves that once they get rid of Hugh and Mary Parsons, everything will be wonderful in Springfield because they've kind of cut out this sort of boil from their midst. Use rather unpleasant metaphor. But actually what you find if you follow the kind of after stories of the participants in the trial is that they're just at each other's throats. They're grasping for each other's land. They sue each other to destruction at the drop of a hat. That really shows that the problem is with them. They are really not particularly nice. Whether it kind of affects other trials, I mean, in Connecticut, there are only 11 executions. Now, of course, each individual one for a crime that we think is imaginary is tragic. But we're talking about 11 executions between 1647 and 1663, and that's it. Even in Massachusetts, we're seeing really very few cases between the 1650s and the 1690s, and even fewer executions. And that's really why what happens at Salem is such an odd aberration. It's not in the middle of anything. It's rather really peculiarly right at the end, with no particular build-up to it. It's just a perfect storm of all the factors that come together to make a witch hunt possible that just all kind of happen at the same time. And that's really why it is so severe. Whether Springfield does this directly or indirectly, you find that by the 1660s in Connecticut, the overriding feeling is skepticism. Not necessarily skepticism of witchcraft, but certainly skepticism of the kind of evidence under which somebody could be reliably convicted. And that's really the difference that does for the crime of witchcraft, not just in America, but in Britain and in Europe too. Along very different kind of timescales, but in the end, it's very difficult to prove that witchcraft doesn't exist, but it can be legislated that you need certain kinds of evidence. And of course, in New England, there's always been an accent on proving the covenant with Satan. And that's really a very hard thing to do. And that, as you see at Springfield, and it's something which the court in Boston is already feeling awkward about, what we're really relying on is hearsay. It's the testimony of neighbours who say that they think that somebody has got it in for them. And in the end, actually, even 17th century courts don't feel that that's enough.
Malcolm, before we head into the time warp, would you tell us why you think it's important for us to seriously acknowledge that colonists had real beliefs in witchcraft and dark magic, and how this perspective, this understanding that they really believed in witchcraft, can help us better understand the worldviews and actions taken by early Americans?
I think that witchcraft is such a good way of understanding mentalities that are not wholly different from our own, but are significantly different. And of course, that's what history is, isn't it? Trying to understand how things were different in the past and how they've changed, how we kind of got to us. Witchcraft is such a peculiar case, though, because it's very difficult for us to imagine what it's like to really believe, and it's very difficult for us to conceptualize their mentalities. But if we're to write about it, it's extremely important that we try. And that, I think, means, and this is certainly something that I've done in the book, which is to take witchcraft at face value as witchcraft, to understand it as their category. Because even in their world, it's not a consensual one, it's not a settled one. It's one about which people disagree all the time, which has a great deal of skepticism. They don't, in a sense, need our skepticism of witchcraft because they've got plenty of it of their own, and their own skepticism of it is, in a sense, much more interesting and relevant to understanding their own mental world. I mentioned earlier that perhaps Mary Parsons was suffering from postpartum psychosis. I think if you start doing that when you're telling a narrative about it, you jolt us back to the present when actually you need to keep working to try to understand things from the time. So I think that perhaps some of the delusions may have been caused by encephalitis. Diphtheria might have been a cause of some of the deaths of children. There was certainly an influenza epidemic that went up and down the Connecticut Valley in the late 1640s. But, they don't always know what these things are. And it's important to explain things, but not to explain it away. That this worldview is important for understanding all sorts of things about the early colonial experience. Not least, of course, because Puritans going to America felt that God had given them a mission. It was their errand in the wilderness, as it's sometimes called, that God had formed a covenant with the Israelites and they'd blown it. And then now the English got another chance and they mustn't blow it. But of course, the experience of so many Puritan pioneers of the 17th century is that in the end they feel that they do. So they live in this magical, religious, providential, diabolical worldview, and it really does inform everything that they do and say and feel.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. So in this case, Malcolm, in your opinion, what might have happened if you and Mary Parsons had never married? Do you think the residents of Springfield still would have set their witchcraft accusations and proceedings in motion if these two had not joined forces and remained single?
The short answer is yes, I think that they would. I think that Hugh and Mary Parsons aren't exactly scapegoats because they are much more involved in Springfield life than that. They're not just some random person you blame things on. They kind of make their own bed, although I think in Mary's case it's not entirely her own fault. The interpretation I would favour for Springfield is that they are figures upon whom the already rather conflicted neighbours project their own awkward feelings. I think that there is a lot of guilt about not living up to ideals, about being in the meeting house, being lectured by George Moxon on Sunday about Christian charity, and then actually going and envying your neighbour's field or his cow or whatever. These are difficult feelings, and I think that Hugh and Mary Parsons have these feelings projected upon them, not consciously, but rather unconsciously. And I think that's something that the people of Springfield would have done to somebody, whether they'd been Hugh and Mary or not. I think there quite likely would have been somebody who kind of fitted the bill, somebody who was kind of outside the centre and wasn't quite playing the game of being a good neighbour and a good burger in Springfield.
We've really been enjoying your work in the North American context, Malcolm. Is colonial North America a place of study that you're going to stick with, or are you moving your research back to England?
Well, I'm actually writing something completely different at the moment. I'm working on a book about prisoners of war and partisans in Second World War Italy. I know that might seem on the face of it wildly different, but in many ways it has grown out of the epilogue, which I provided for The Ruin of All Witches, where I do kind of break the fourth wall. I describe what it's like to be a historian actually uncovering a story, and that's really what the whole of this book will be about, how we tell stories about the past and about the temptations to flights of fancy and how in the end we have to be guided by documentary sources. And when there are gaps, well, quite often we have to be silent on that subject.
If we have more questions about Hugh and Mary Parsons or witchcraft and witches in the early modern period, where's the best place to reach you?
You can Google me and you'll probably find all sorts of interviews and articles and things that I've written. You can, of course, look for my books on Amazon or some other respectable outlet, and that would tell you much more than I can ever tell you in a podcast about my ideas and interests. And you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet quite a lot, and I have quite a lot of tweets there about witchcraft and other matters as they arise. So at Malcolm Gaskill, do follow me.
Malcolm Gaskill, Thank you for rejoining us and for helping us better understand witches and witchcraft in 17th century English America.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure, Liz.
When studying witches and witchcraft throughout early America and the early modern world, it is important that we accept witchcraft as colonial Americans understood it, as a real phenomenon. As Malcolm reminded us, anytime we try to look at witches and witchcraft as a method that colonial Americans used to explain away the unexplainable, we bring our present-day world and present-day ideas into the early modern world. This action clouds our understanding of past peoples, places, and events because we end up removing them from their true time and context. If we understand witches and witchcraft as real early modern phenomena, then we can see what witchcraft accusations can really show us. The nature of bad relationships colonial Americans had with their neighbors. As Malcolm stated, witchcraft is a good way for us to try and understand mentalities that are significantly different from our own. History is the study of people and societies over time. We study people, places, and events over time to better understand how we developed into the people that we are today. And part of developing this better understanding means we don't need to dismiss or explain away witchcraft incidents. We just need to accept them for what they were, conflicts between neighbors that some colonial Americans blamed on witches and dark magic. Look for more information about Malcolm, his book, The Ruin of All Witches, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/370. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this episode of Ben Franklin's World, please share it with your friends and family. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Joseph Edelman, Katie Schinnebeck, Ashley Bachnight-Claybrooks, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other stories of witches and witchcraft would you like to investigate? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.